The state of New York had put men to death in its electric chair. It had never put a woman in it. In the autumn of 1895, in a cell at the end of a corridor in Sing Sing prison, the state was preparing to change that. The woman waiting in that cell was 26 years old. Her name was Maria Barbella. She had come from a hill town in the south of Italy. By most accounts, she could neither read nor write, and she did not speak enough English to have told the court that condemned her what had really happened. She was the only woman in the whole prison, with no one of her own to speak to, and nothing to do but wait. A few steps down the corridor stood the wooden chair, wired for current, that was waiting for her. The newspapers had already decided who she was. They printed a name that was not even hers, Maria Barberi. They called her a degenerate, and they were wrong about almost everything. This is the story of how a seamstress from Basilicata came to be the only woman on a death corridor in Sing Sing, and of how nearly everything said about her was wrong. Cases like hers have a way of slipping out of memory altogether. If you would like to see more of them brought back to light, you can help by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It began with a man Maria used to pass on her way to work. She had arrived in 1892, one of 250,000 Italians who landed in America that year, most of them poor, most of them looking for the kind of work that no one else wanted. She settled with her family in a part of Lower Manhattan called Mulberry Bend, at the edge of the old Five Points. It was one of the poorest and most crowded districts in the city, a place of dim tenement stairs and back rooms where whole families lived in a space meant for one person. It was where the newcomers from her own country gathered, and it was where a young woman was watched by everyone she knew. Maria found work the way most of the women around her did, in the needle trade, bent over piecework for long hours in a crowded shop and bringing home about $8 a week. Every morning, the walk to the factory took her past a shoeshine stand on the corner, kept by a man named Domenico Cataldo. Cataldo was from her own part of Italy. He had done well in America, better than most who arrived with nothing. At first, he and Maria only spoke in passing. Then he began to walk her part way home, never the whole way, because she did not want her father to see. Her father, Michele, was a careful man who knew exactly what this country could do to a girl from their village. When he found out about Cataldo, he forbade Maria to see him again, and for a time she obeyed. Then Cataldo came back, more insistent than before, and she let him. He told her he wanted to marry her, and that, as his wife, she would never sit at a sewing machine again. To prove that he meant it, he showed her a small savings book with $400 written down inside, more than a woman in the needle trade could put away in a year of long days. It was the kind of proof a careful person might let herself believe, and she did. There was a great deal the savings book did not say. By Maria's account, Cataldo had given her a drink one evening that left her senseless, and then treated her criminally, and afterward she felt she could no longer go home to her parents. A girl raised as she had been understood what that meant. Once it was done, she was bound to him whether he kept his word or not. He repeated his promise of marriage. He found rooms where the two of them could live together, and still he put the wedding off, week after week, with one excuse and then another. Maria pressed him. The date kept moving. The months went by. Then the truth came out. Cataldo was already married. He had a wife and children waiting in Italy, and he meant to sail back to them and leave Maria behind. The savings book, the promise, the rooms they shared, all of it had been arranged around a wedding that was never going to happen. He had even told her, she would later say, how he expected it to go. He would find her a husband, present her to the man as a young widow, buy her a black dress for the part, and visit her once she was safely married to someone else. When it became clear that he was leaving, Maria's mother, a woman named Filomena, went to Cataldo herself and begged him to do right by her daughter. He said that he would, for $200, a sum the family did not have and could not raise. For a woman raised as Maria had been, none of this was only a private sorrow. In the world she came from, a woman left this way could not expect to marry, could expect to be talked about for the rest of her life, and could expect her whole family to carry the shame beside her. She was young, alone in a country whose language she could not yet speak, and tied to a man who was about to step onto a ship. She had been ruined by a promise, and the promise had been a lie from the start. On the 26th of April, 1895, Cataldo was due to board a ship for Italy that afternoon. It was the end of a sudden hot spell. The day before, the temperature had climbed into the 90s, and the streets of lower Manhattan were close and airless. That morning, Maria found him in a saloon on East 13th Street, playing cards with 3 other men from the old country. She asked him, one more time, whether he was going to marry her. He barely looked up from the table. "Only a pig can marry you," he said, and told her to go away, that he was leaving, and went back to his hand. What came next took only a moment. Maria struck him once with a razor she had carried in her clothing. He rose from the chair, with both hands at his throat, pushed past her, and got out the door, and a little way down the street. He made it as far as the corner of Avenue A, where he fell, and a few minutes later he was dead. She went home and changed her dress. The police found her before the day was out, and she did not deny what she had done. "Me take his blood, so he no take mine," she told them in the broken English she had then. "Say me pig marry." They took her to the city prison downtown, the grim stone building New Yorkers called the Tombs, and there she stayed for the better part of 3 months before her trial began. Her trial opened on the 11th of July and lasted only 5 days. From the first of them, there were 2 Maria Barbellas in the room, and the jury would have to decide which one was real. The prosecution described a woman who had planned a murder. She had carried the razor on purpose, they said. She had killed Cataldo not only for the insult, but for his money. The savings book he had once shown her, the proof of his promise, had been real enough. The prosecutors said he kept more than $800 in the bank, and she could reach none of it unless he were dead, and she were taken for his widow. By that account, the book that had ruined her had also been her reason to kill. The razor in her clothing was not despair. It was a plan, carried in a pocket, waiting for the moment. The defense described someone else entirely, a woman undone by a broken promise, who had loved Cataldo, who had wanted a husband and not a corpse, and who could not afterward remember the act at all. Her lawyers laid out the kind of man Cataldo had been, a man with a habit of seducing young women and moving on. Her mother took the stand and told the jury how she had pleaded with him, and how he had laughed and named his price. When the prosecutors pressed Maria on why she had stayed with a man of such character, her answer was simple. She had loved him, but her own words reached the jury only through the interpreter, who delivered them without color, in a dull monotone, so that whatever she felt arrived flattened and far away. The 12 men who would decide between the 2 stories did not include a single Italian. In the Italian quarter of the city, people said openly that a jury like that, hearing a frightened woman through a man who seemed to want them bored, could never have understood her at all. One small fact, a razor carried in a woman's clothing, sat at the center of 2 accounts that could not both be true. One was a story of greed, the other was a story of ruin. The jury would have to choose, and they would not hear either version in Maria's own voice. There was a man who might have given Maria the benefit of the doubt, and chose not to. His name was John Goff, and he was the judge. First, the defense asked that she be tried for murder in the 2nd degree, a charge that would not have carried a death sentence. Goff refused. Then, when the time came to instruct the jury, he told them plainly that a woman should expect no special compassion from the court, and that the law did not soften for the weakness of her sex. He warned them not to be moved by the fragility that was sometimes used to excuse savage crimes, And he went further still. The fact that she had taken up the razor and kept it, he said, required thought, and thought was the very thing the law called premeditation. Without ever using the word, he had told the jury how to vote. They did not take long. Less than an hour after they left the room, they returned with a verdict of murder in the first degree. There were people in that courtroom who believed the jurors had felt for her, even as they condemned her, that they had done what the judge told them to do against their own sympathy. It made no difference now. On the 18th of July, Goff sentenced Maria Barbella to death. The method would be the electric chair. It was new then, brought into use only a few years earlier, in 1890, and sold to the public as a cleaner and more humane death than the rope. It had not lived up to the promise. The first man put in it had not died at the first attempt. The current had been run, the witnesses had believed it was over, and then it became clear that it was not, and it had to be done a second time before he was gone. People remembered that, and no woman had ever been put in the chair at all. Maria was taken up the river to Sing Sing, to the cell at the end of the corridor, and to the chair that was waiting there. About a month after the arrest, on a June morning, a woman named Cora Slocum was having breakfast on the terrace of her country house in the north of Italy. She was leafing through a copy of the New York Times that had crossed the ocean and reached her weeks late, and a short paragraph caught her eye. The small headline read, "Killed because he refused to marry her." It told, in a few lines, of a young immigrant who had cut a man's throat in a saloon in Lower Manhattan. Cora Slocum was not the sort of reader the editors had in mind. She had been born in New Orleans, into a wealthy family, raised in Connecticut in the Quaker faith after her father's death, and tutored in France and Germany. She spoke 4 languages. In 1887, she had married an Italian count and settled on his family estate, and she had spent the years since building something unusual. She had founded a string of lace-making schools, 7 in all, to teach poor women a trade and lift them out of poverty. A woman ruined and abandoned and now condemned was exactly the kind of woman she had spent her life trying to reach. She had every reason to leave the case to the courts that had already decided it. Instead, she crossed the ocean. Cora Slocum went to see Maria in prison. The lawyers Maria had were not good enough, so she found better ones and paid for them, and she brought in a missionary named Rebecca Foster to work beside her. Together, the 2 women did something that had not been done in quite this way in America before. They built a public campaign to save a single condemned prisoner, and they aimed it at everyone at once. It worked in a way the prosecutors had not imagined. Letters arrived from across the country and from across the sea. Petitions reached the desk of Governor Levi Morton, carrying thousands of names. The same newspapers that had called Maria a degenerate now ran columns under headlines like "To Save Maria Barbella," and printed the appeals of readers who had never met her and never would. What Cora Slocum set in motion is remembered as the first organized campaign against the death penalty the country had seen. For one strange season, the fate of a poor immigrant seamstress was argued over in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue and the back streets of Little Italy alike, by people who agreed on almost nothing else. And here was the thing the whole case kept turning on. Maria could not speak for herself. Not in English, not in a courtroom, not to a reporter at her cell door. Cora Slocum could speak to anyone she chose, to the wealthy and the poor, and the men who held power, and she chose to spend that voice on a woman she had never met. The one who had no voice was being defended, at last, by the one who had nothing else. The governor would not act while the courts still held the case, and so everything came down to an appeal. In the spring of 1896, it reached New York's highest court, and the verdict came back undone. Maria's new lawyer was a man named Frederick House, and he took the first trial apart, piece by piece. The state, he said, had offered no real evidence of premeditation at all. Goff had kept out testimony about the kind of man Cataldo was, the sort of evidence that might have changed how the jury saw her. He had misstated the facts of the case to the men deciding it. And there was the heaviest charge of all, that the judge's instruction had not been guidance, but a plain direction to convict. The Court of Appeals read the whole record, and on the 21st of April it agreed. The judges found that Goff's charge to the jury was riddled with serious error and showed a troubling want of impartiality from the bench. They threw out the conviction and ordered a new trial. In the New York papers, the story ran under a headline that would have been unthinkable a year before: Recorder Goff's Errors. It was a rare thing, a court turning around to admit that the law had very nearly killed in the wrong. By the time the ruling came down, Maria had spent 11 months in a cell with a death sentence hanging over her. Now she would wait again, this time for a second trial, a second jury, and a second chance to be heard. And by the time that chance came, for the first time, she would be able to take it in her own English. The waiting changed her in a way the first court could never have foreseen. At Sing Sing, the warden's wife, a woman named Julia Sage, took an interest in the only female prisoner in her husband's care. She sat with Maria through the long months. She and the warden helped her learn English, word by word, until the woman who had once been a silent figure in a courtroom could finally say what she meant. What the lawyers found, as they prepared the second defense, was that something had been wrong in Maria's family for a very long time. They called numerous witnesses from among the Italians who had known both her parents' families back home. It became clear that her ancestors and all of her brothers and sisters had suffered from seizures, some of them severe, a few of them fatal, and that there had been heavy drinking in the family as well. And there was testimony the first trial had never allowed. Her parents told the second court that years earlier, Maria had tried to take her own life and had remembered nothing of it afterward, once she was restrained. When Maria herself spoke, what she said was strange and quiet. "Sometimes I feel a machine in my head," she told the court, "and the pain is so great I cannot stand it." Julia Sage believed what she had seen with her own eyes. This was not a woman, she testified, who was capable of planning a murder. It was an unusual thing for the wife of a prison warden to put her name to, in public, on behalf of a convicted killer, in front of reporters who would print it. She put it there anyway. The second trial ran far longer than the first, and most of it was a quarrel between doctors. The defense no longer rested on self-defense, though there was something to it. Cataldo had been carrying a knife when he died, a fact the police had recorded at the scene, and the lawyers could have built an argument on it. Instead, they chose a far riskier one, an argument that asked the jury to believe Maria had not really chosen anything at all. They said that Cataldo's insult had set off a fit, a seizure of the kind that ran in her family, and that during it she had not known what her hands were doing. It was a defense that had almost never worked. It had succeeded only a handful of times anywhere in the world, and never once before in an American court. There was also the matter of why she had the razor with her at all. Now that she could be heard, Maria told the court something the first trial had never let her say. She had brought the razor that morning, meaning to use it on herself, not on Cataldo, if he turned her away one last time. She had gone to the saloon expecting to die, not to kill. Of the moment after his words about pigs, she said she could remember nothing at all, nothing but a red flash and an overwhelming heat in her head. For 9 days, the doctors argued it back and forth in front of the jury. The defense brought experts who said the illness had pulled the razor, that a woman in the grip of such a fit was not in command of herself. The prosecution brought experts who said she had been in full command the whole time, and always had been, and that the fit was a story built to save her neck. In his closing argument, one of her lawyers set the entire case on a single claim. "The only truth here," he told the jury, "is that Maria Barbella suffers from epilepsy. There was one more thing that hung over the courtroom, though no one needed to say it aloud. The chair that waited for Maria had been promised once before. A year earlier, it had been meant for a woman named Lizzie Halliday, condemned for more than one killing. A commission of physicians could not agree among themselves whether she was sane, and the governor commuted her sentence to life. So the first woman New York had meant to put in that chair was one who had killed, by most accounts, again and again, and was spared. The woman it now marched toward the same chair was one who said she could not remember killing once. On the 10th of December 1896, the second jury went out to decide. They were gone about 40 minutes. When they filed back into the courtroom, the verdict was not guilty. Maria Barbella was free to walk out that same day, after nearly a year and a half, with a death sentence over her, and a chair at the end of a corridor with her name on it. The first jury had needed 3/4 of an hour to send her toward that chair. The second needed 40 minutes to let her live. The facts of that morning in the saloon had not changed at all. What had changed was that this time the court had let her be heard. The first thing she did with her freedom was reach for a telephone. It was a new machine then, still a novelty, and she used it to call Julia Sage and Cora Slocum and give them the news herself, in her own voice. There is a quiet arithmetic in that. The state of New York had built one new machine to take her life by current. Maria used another new machine to tell the two women who had stood by her that she would be keeping it. What the jury never settled, and what no one settled in the years that followed, was what had truly happened in that saloon. Whether a sickness moved her hand, or grief, or a plain decision made in a single hot instant and never taken back, the record does not say and cannot say. She walked out of the courthouse without that answer. So did everyone else who had spent 2 years arguing about her. What came after was the part the newspapers had no use for. Maria Barbella did not become a symbol, or a warning, or a lesson in anything. She became an ordinary woman with a long life still ahead of her. The same papers that had spent the better part of 2 years arguing over whether she should live lost interest in her almost the moment she did. Not long after her release, her name reached print one last time. A neighbor had caught fire, the woman's clothes alight in an instant, and Maria did not hesitate. She took up a blanket and beat the flames out with her own hands, the same hands the state had once measured for its chair. In 1897, she married a man named Francesco Paolo Bruno, who had come from her own corner of Italy. 2 years after that, she had a son. The case that had filled the front pages let her go, and she let it go. The years closed over her quietly. By 1940, she was living under a new name, Mary Di Chiara, with a second husband on a street on the Lower East Side, an old woman among neighbors who very likely had no idea who she had once been. She died in 1950 at the age of 81 and was buried under that name, the one almost no one ever connected to the seamstress who had once been the only woman in Sing Sing. The others went their own ways. Cora Slocum returned to Italy and to her schools and her other causes, and she died in Rome in 1944 at the age of 82. The campaign she had built outlived the case that started it. Julia Sage's husband went on running his prison, and his wife went on holding her own opinion of the woman she had helped to save. The electric chair stayed in use, on others, for many years after, and Maria Barbella lived more than half a century past, the morning she had been told she would die in it. Of everything ever said and printed about her, that was the one thing almost no one had believed possible. If a story like Maria's stays with you, that is reason enough to keep telling it. As always, I would love to hear from you in the comments.